Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
The Indian Revolution particularly got my attention because, as far as I know, it is the only independence movement that didn't require a war.
Most of the violence occurred after the British left.
Yes. And the reason it didn't is because of beingness. You know,
I love that word.
Yes. Well, I think it's a very important word, and I think we should be much more familiar with it. A young reporter went up to Gandhi just before he was assassinated in 1948, and said to him, you know, how did you force the British to leave India? My editor wants to know. That was that one question. How did you force this huge geopolitical power to give up its most precious, the crown jewel of its empire? The Queen was the Empress of India. How did you force them to do that? You didn't have an army. You didn't have any official position. You didn't have any particular money. How did you do that? And the answer that Gandhi gave is, I think, the critical answer about nonviolence. He said, it isn't what we did that mattered, although that mattered. It isn't what we said that mattered, although that mattered. It was the nature of our character, who we are as people, that caused the British to choose to leave India. They voluntarily withdrew.
This is crucial because what you're saying is nonviolence is much more than simply refraining from violence.
Oh, yes.
It has to do with, as you said, beingness. It's the what happens to people inside of themselves that gives them a kind of spiritual power.
Yes. Well, you know, I have said often, and let me say it again here, there is no force in human society more powerful than the collective intention of ordinary people. It's much more powerful than corporations or armies or anything. And you can see that in what Gandhi did. And he did it, I mean, let us take just one event, the salt riots, which are what really caused the break. You make a very important point. I talked to people who were alive and participated in that. And they told me that Gandhi recruited the salt riot. I mean, for those who are completely unfamiliar with it, there was a tax that was placed. It's like the tea tax in the American Revolution. There was a tax placed on making salt. Now, anybody can make salt. You go out and get a bucket full of salt water and just let the water evaporate, and lo and behold, you have salt. So, I mean, this was something quite easily done, and yet, particularly for poor people, salt being, and particularly in a very hot country, very critical. You need a certain amount of salt to survive properly. Putting a tax on salt was a big problem. So Gandhi focused on that. He found the leverage point. But here's the key, the point you're making. This was not just nonviolence. He trained people. One of the men who participated, now a very elderly man, one of the things that he told me, he said he trained us like soldiers. He set up like boot camps and trained them how not to resist. And so comes the day of the salt riot, and there's
a big march to the sea.
They marched. They marched a long distance. Took a number of days to get there. They marched to the sea. They marched to where the salt was being made, and they walked forward 11 abreast. Now, on the British side, there's Indian troops, but standing behind the Indian troops are British officers. And the Indian troops are armed with large stays, sort of like axe handles, large staffs. And This is all done in silence. 11 people march forward. They're clubbed to the ground by the Indian troops. The women who had been trained to be basically the medics run forward, take the bodies, pull them back, bandage their heads, bleeding heads where they were struck by these staffs. 11 more people march forward. They're struck to the ground. The women run forward and take the bodies back. 11 more march forward. No complaining, no screaming, no yelling, nothing. Just they march forward, struck to the ground. This goes on for all
as I
morning.
recall, they didn't even put their arms up to resist the blows.
No, they didn't. They walked forward. Their beingness was their weapon. They walked forward, struck to the ground. This goes on all morning. And suddenly something happens. Nobody says anything. No orders are given. Something suddenly happens. The consciousness changes. The Indian troops look at each other. They look at these people who are their countrymen lying on the ground bleeding. They look at their British officers and they say, we're not going to do this anymore. That's how he did it. He changed the beingness of the collective intention of the people who participated in the riot, changed the consciousness of the troops. And they looked at their British officers and said, no more. We're not doing this.